Hi everyone, it is Justina again, and today I'm going to quickly talk to you about week 3 in general. So to start, as I mentioned at the end of last week's video, that you are going to have to actually watch a film this week, and as I mentioned before also, the film is about Alice Paul, who was a suffragist, and most of her work her activism occurred in the early 20th century or early 1900s. And she's considered to be a more militant suffragist, and compared to previous suffragists working, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, her tactics were more in your face, less diplomatic, and she used things like she used things like hunger strikes that encouraged or forced force feedings while they were in prison. So I hope you enjoyed learning about her, and I do want to have a little discussion with you about the actual film. So the film is called Iron Jawed Angels. It was made, I believe, in the early 2000s, so it's a little old. It was made for HBO, and it's very much it's a fictional history. It has many historical inaccuracies, and so I have provided you with a summary of those historical inaccuracies, and please read that before you actually start the film, because it will be helpful to you as you're thinking about the movie and recognizing what's real and what's not real. So we've talked about that historians use primary sources and secondary sources, right? And primary sources are sources that are created during the time in which events were occurring, right? So if it's a letter written during the Civil War, that's a great primary source from the Civil War, right? But it can also be oral histories with people that lived through events, but the interviews can happen many decades later even. Okay, so primary sources are a little confusing, but secondary sources are typically created by writers or historians that use a collection of both primary sources and other secondary sources to interpret history, right? And so I would claim, or I would argue, that this film is a secondary source because it's using a combination of secondary and primary sources to create this narrative, and it's somewhat historically inaccurate, so definitely a secondary source, right? But we can still learn from it in an enjoyable way. So secondary, always be thinking about primary and secondary sources, right? So this week we're not only talking about women's suffragists and the suffrage movement, but we're also going to be discussing, we have to cram so much this week because of this 5-week limit, but we're also going to be discussing, or you're going to be learning about the New Deal, the Great Depression, and then the New Deal under FDR's presidency, as well as World War II. And then at the very end, the last documents you're going to read are a collection of sources that are dealing with President Truman's decision to use the nuclear bombs to end World War II, at least within the Japanese front. So this decision to use the bomb is a very controversial one, and one that is still argued about by historians and the general public, whether or not it was a good decision or the right decision. So I want you to grapple with this, but I also want you to think about how history is not just a set of facts, but it's actually an interpretation of the past by people who are utilizing and looking at collections of primary sources and secondary sources. So please remember to think about history and the writing of history as a constant and ever-changing interpretation of the past. The way that it changes oftentimes is by bringing in new sources that haven't been looked at before, or incorporating other peoples that haven't been examined. For example, studying slaves and then thinking about the Civil War from the perspective of freed slaves or slaves that fought in the war, right? That's going to change the way you examine it if you are just looking at the diplomatic history regarding the Civil War. So think about how history can change according to the interpretation of it. And if you have questions about that, I encourage you to email me, because I know that can be a confusing concept. But what I'm going to have you do, so your skill this week, last week I gave you a thesis and then you had to pull evidence to prove that thesis. This week you're going to be doing another step. So you're actually going to write your own thesis and then you're going to pull evidence to support your thesis. I give you a video in the assessment that talks about thesis writing. It's kind of a silly video, but it breaks it down in a very simplistic way, and I appreciate kind of procedural understandings of writing. It helps me to break it down and makes it easier, so I kind of try to incorporate that into my classes. So I encourage you, please watch the video, but in the video it talks about three-pronged theses, that you have an argument and then you show 3 examples through these prongs, and this will make more sense once you actually watch the other video. But this week I'm not going to have you write a 3-pronged thesis. You're just going to write an argument, so one way or another. So for example, one of the questions you're going to be asked to write whether you believe the bomb should, or based on the, let me back up. Based on the evidence that you're given, was it the right decision to drop the bombs, nuclear bombs, or was it not? Make sure you're writing in third person, so no I or we or us. But you only just need to make your thesis be an argument one way or the other. You don't need the prongs. Next week you will be incorporating prongs, so please, if you have questions about that, I encourage you to ask. I think that's it, really. So please watch the film. It's going to take a little bit longer than some of the readings this week, so do that earlier in the week. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me and I will get back to you. All right, I hope you have a great week. Bye.